Hello, and welcome to this second part of the case study concerning the Plague of Athens. In the previous video, I gave an extremely condensed summary explaining the events that led to the plague, which, as I stated, occurred during the Peloponnesian War. These events will form the focus of future videos. But if anyone wants to examine the Peloponnesian War and the earlier Greco-Persian Wars in more detail, there are many books and websites to help you. I will provide some sources at the end of this video, but the bibliography I put at the end of the previous video should also be sufficient to give you a good basic understanding of the background leading up to the plague. What our focus in this particular installment is the witness testimony of the plague provided by the historian Thucydides. We shall first examine his account in both ancient Greek and English. Emphasis here will be on what he wrote about the experience of being in Athens during the time of plague, what he saw and how it changed the behaviour of his fellow Athenians. Before beginning, I would just like to point out that the Greek and English translations are taken from an extremely useful website for the ancient Greek and Roman world called the Perseus Digital Library that is run by the Department of Classics, Tufts University in the United States. From this site, you can find many original Greek and Roman sources in both their Greek and Latin versions, and also in translation. But more on this site another time. Returning to our main subject, Thucydides tells us that the plague first arrived in Athens during the Peloponnesian War, when Attica, the land within which Athens is located, was being subjected to brutal attacks by the Spartans. They willfully destroyed villages, crops, and livestock. The scorched earth policy taken to an extreme. Thucydides describes where the plague came from, how it arrived in Athens, spread through the city, and how it completely disrupted daily life, normal rituals, and led to chaos and even hedonism. As we can see from the first part of his description, Thucydides directly connects the plague to the Spartans, who are laying waste to the country. Almost immediately after, the plague seems to appear in Athens. He mentions that it possibly arrived in Lemnos sometime before, but that it was at its most intense and destructive in Athens. Doctors were powerless against it. Not knowing what it was, they had no means to treat it. As we can see from Thucydides' account, they too fell victim to the plague, dying in large numbers, unable to help. Priests were no help either. People made dedications in the temples, prayers were made. Diviners, the people who look for omens and signs to interpret and to predict the future or the will of the gods, were unable to read the signs. All the traditional religious rituals seemed futile. According to Thucydides, the plague originated in Ethiopia, passed through Egypt and Libya, and arrived in Athens via the port of Piraeus, where it attacked the population there. It is interesting that he tells us that the people of Piraeus said that the Spartans had poisoned the reservoirs, which remains a possibility, but we can examine this in a later video. What he tells us though is that it moved from Piraeus up into the city of Athens itself. This must be because the port was a site of trade and commerce, and once the plague was at the port, it would be very difficult to stop it spreading to the rest of the city. Thucydides tells us his reasons for describing the plague. he wants to set aside all its possible origins and causes and leaves these to others to speculate upon. He will only explain the symptoms to help its being identified in the future. He feels that he is well placed to do so because he had the plague himself. His description of the symptoms is very detailed, and in many places it appears accurate. I have chosen not to put all of his account on the screen here, but instead to list the main symptoms and then emphasize some of the key parts he discusses. Listing these here, we can see a wide range of symptoms that appear to affect the whole body. The head is particularly affected with heat, swelling and redness around the eyes, blood in the throat producing fetid breath, sneezing, coughing and vomiting. The body itself was infected and marked by small ulcers. The afflicted were unable to sleep due to feeling so hot. They were incredibly thirsty but could not quench their thirst. They suffered from stomach ulcers and severe diarrhea, and when the disease spread to the lower body, many lost body parts, including fingers, toes, genitalia, while it was not unheard of for those people to also lose eyes and even their memories. This disease affected the head so much that people actually went insane. Picking out some of the key points of his description, we can focus on his descriptions of the insufferable heat first and the devastating effects the plague had on the mind and body. As we can see on the screen here, he tells us that people suffered from an internal heat. The skin broke out in blisters, but it wasn't hot to touch, nor did it look pale. Yet people suffered from the heat so much that they looked for ways to cool down. This first involved people throwing off their clothes in desperation. They couldn't bear to feel anything on their skin. They tried in vain to stay cool and would have loved to have thrown themselves into cold water, but none was available. The sick who were neglected, however, did indeed throw themselves into the city wells to also quench their thirst, which no matter how they tried, their thirst remained unsated. Another key point he mentions is the devastating effect this plague had on the infected. We are told by Thucydides that when it arrived in the body, the illness started in the head. It then progressed down through the rest of the body and often proved fatal, ending in death. However, he notes that even in those cases where people survived, it left its mark on the body, with people losing their extremities such as fingers, toes, and even their genitals. Even the mind could be affected, which further illustrates this devastating disease. Thucydides provides us with some information on how the disease was allowed to spread. He tells us that, due to the Spartan army pillaging and ravaging the countryside around Athens, that the people of this area, which as I said before is called Attica, they rushed into the city to seek refuge. Unlike our modern pandemic, there was no lockdown here, for this was a period of history when people were unaware of how to treat diseases, and so few preemptive decisions were made. This undoubtedly caused the plague to spread really quickly because there just wasn't space for all these new refugees. In fact, the lack of space saw these people housed in temporary cabins that he describes as stiflingly hot. The disease quickly passed through these cabins, helped by the conditions, and the bodies of the dying were simply placed in the streets, one on top of the other. While the translation of Thucydides' work from Greek into English may lose some of its power, its impact in the description, we still have a really strong idea of what happened. Because Thucydides, we can quote him here, and it's a quote that can give us a good idea of the desperation of the time, because he says that half-dead creatures reeled about the streets and gathered round all the fountains in their longing for water. It gives us the idea of a kind of a zombie-like situation with people walking around in a daze, not knowing what was happening, and it really sounds like a desperate time for the people of Athens. The consequences of this overcrowding with these new refugees, it was really catastrophic. The temples, sanctuaries, and other sacred areas had also housed the infected, yet these too were now full of bodies. This led to a breakdown in normal life. The religious and sacred areas were no longer respected. As a result, the Athenians no longer buried their dead according to traditional rituals. Burials took place in a rather haphazard way. This included throwing dead bodies onto another person's funeral pyre, sometimes throwing the other body off first and then setting light to the pyre. There was little respect for the dead during what must have been a period of sheer desperation. Respect for the law also broke down. Citizens now did things in public they had previously done only in private. Many, who may originally have been poor, now took over the property of the recently deceased rich. Furthermore, the devastation of the plague, lawlessness, and concern for the future led to a kind of hedonism and a devil-may-care attitude. To quote Thucydides, people resolved to spend their money quickly and enjoy themselves, regarding their lives and riches as alike things of a day. Honour was disregarded, and people gave in to their carnal desires. People no longer feared the gods nor laws. The plague had put a stop to that. Regardless of whether they prayed or not, they thought it was inevitable that they too would succumb to the disease, and so they did what they wanted. Similarly, people broke the law with impunity because they felt there was little chance of them being prosecuted. As a result, there was a complete disregard for the civilization that Athens had become famous for. This is an important development, and we will handle this decline in civilization that Thucydides describes in the next video. Until then, I hope you've enjoyed this video and the review of Thucydides' description of the Plague of Athens. Stay tuned for the next instalment in this case study.